I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And I am joined in person, and he's come a long way. I think he's come halfway around the world just to be here. I've got Dr. Dave Lawie from Imdex joining me. Welcome, and good to see you in person.
Yeah, it is, Mike, and in New York. So we've done London online, now New York. It sort of makes sense.
Yeah, and we're here on location at the Current Trends in Mining Finance Conference that is being put on by the New York chapter of the SME. And so far, it's been a good conference. Lots of discussions.
Yeah, very interesting, and a brilliant venue as well. I've never been to New York, period, let alone this event. But no, just amazing.
Yeah, the venue here is over the top exceptional, as we were talking about off mic. Before we get into our discussion, tell us a little bit about Imdex for people that aren't familiar with it.
Yeah, so Imdex is a mining technology company. We're listed on the ASX. We're about $1 billion valuation. We operate globally, though. Head office is in Perth. I think if you drilled a hole straight through the middle of the Earth from New York, it'd come out pretty close to Perth, I think, actually. But we're a global company, and in fact, the Americas, North and South America, is the biggest region of our three global regions, revenue-wise. So we're active, we're global. It's the first time we've been to this event, but obviously, given the theme in mining finance and how it contributes to what we do in the industry, it's particularly relevant, I think.
Yeah, and becoming more relevant every day. So let's go down into our conversation. 2 weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. at another conference, which was a energy metals transition conference. And now I'm here, and I have basically been inundated by government messaging, current, critical metals, critical metals, critical metals, critical metals. And it's always been the same thing: electric vehicles, power grid, solar panels, wind turbines, and everything. I don't think that's where the problem is. I think it's infrastructure. What say you?
Yes, I mean, critical minerals is a useful term, although it annoys geologists because they're metals that we're looking for, not the minerals. But anyway, that's an aside. Critical minerals are typically thin markets, right? So even cobalt, nickel, lithium, things like that. We can fairly, I won't say easily, but we can supply those things within a rational time frame if the price is right. But what I think is actually the bigger driver and what the world needs are what I would call lots of infrastructure materials. So, if you look at the history, and I will speak about a little bit about this tonight, if you look at the history of what humanity's consumed to get to where we're at, everything is up and to the right, and the intensity of the extraction of materials is only increasing. And they're not the critical minerals, right? We're talking about the boring things like limestone for making cement and iron for steel, copper, a particularly important one. You could put it on the critical list as well as the infrastructure list, which we've been exploiting, for millennia, but we've been exploiting hard and looking for it since 1900, if you can go back that far. So we are going to hit rate limiting deterministic things with extracting these materials for what we need. And I think another complication overriding or becoming more obvious daily is the impact of climate change and sea level rise and things like that, which means that an almost unimaginable amount of infrastructure will need to be hardened against events and sea level rise and things like that. It's easy to say, but to do all of that requires, again, the extractive industries to be exploiting things harder and faster if we want to get anything done in that space.
Yeah, no, it is. And, I've seen interesting things where they're now trying to protect homes in the hurricane alleys of the United States, the Floridas, the Carolinas, the Louisianas, the Texas, for more powerful hurricane winds so that they're going to be able to stand up to the winds. And there is an awful lot of resources that have to go into those new buildings.
Look, there really is. And one example I will talk about later today is the Ike Dike, as it's called, to protect the Gulf around Galveston and the huge petrochemical industry in this country that's built around the Gulf. There's a project which the US Army is looking at to extend and raise the protection along the coast there, with thing they call the Ike Dike. It's a $60 billion US program of work that they're putting up, and they're ascribing virtually the whole causation of it to ice melting in the Antarctic. Now, this story was around about a month ago. I read it. I sort of said, yeah, really? Well, just when I was sitting in the hotel this morning, just looking at the news feed, there were two separate articles, one on CNN, another one on the BBC, I think, just talking about exactly this problem. Now, that's a small example, but a big dollar value to build something to harden infrastructure against climate change. I think we don't think about those impacts enough and what we need to do. And I don't think that we think around the time frame around these changes as they're happening as well.
No, and forget just rising sea levels. I'm a former resident of British Columbia. I have friends who live in California and Oregon and Washington State. And fire season's getting there earlier and earlier and earlier every year. They've already have had massive wildfires in northern British Columbia that have caused evacuations. And, we're just past the Canadian May long weekend, which is historically, it's technically not the start of summer, but in people's minds it is.
Yeah.
And wildfire season isn't supposed to start that early. Even in this infrastructure discussion that we're having, there's movement afoot to how do they protect buildings within these intermediary areas between, cities and forest in places like that. And I suspect you guys have similar issues in Australia.
Yeah, the green fringe, we call it living on the green fringe. And in fact, it's having, well, apart from the fires themselves, it's becoming a problem with just insurance and paying insurance. And even, I know at least in parts of Australia, you can't subdivide land anymore. They just won't let you build in some of these places because the risk is just too extreme. Certain slopes and certain blocks that face a certain way, they just won't let you build there anymore. So it's becoming quite limiting because there's, like everywhere in the Western world, housing is also a problem, lack of it. But then you have these sorts of effects which are preventing people from building housing, actually. And if you can build it, it will be more expensive because it needs to be hardened against whatever the particular problem is in your part of the world.
Yeah, and you mentioned insurance. That's even if you can get insurance. There are parts of the United States now, because of climate impact disasters increasing, where you guess technically can get house insurance, but it's almost cost prohibitive to do.
Yes.
In Louisiana, a lot of people are now insurerless because the insurance companies have pulled out of that state. It's starting to happen in Florida. Now those are due to hurricane risks, but I'm hearing kind of similar stories where insurance costs in British Columbia for some of my friends' places in the interior, which is, more forest area rather than the city of Vancouver, their insurance costs are going through the roof. So, there's not only new building construction, there's got to be costs in retrofitting these buildings to make them less prone to the disasters.
Yeah, you can never build them so they're completely immune from natural disasters, but even just that hardening component is literally a drain on resources and labor and all sorts of things. And I think one of the ultimate effects of this happening now is it's going to bake in inflation permanently, because there will be this constant demand and supply tug of war to accelerate, if you like, hardening of infrastructure now. So it will impact all of the major economies. This on top of the critical minerals debate and decarb and all the rest is a whole entire other thing, which is happening and will impact the mining industry.
Well, yeah, no, we're talking about the infrastructure, and we're talking about hardening, infrastructure, hardening buildings, and that. In my life, most recently, I got relocated, as my listeners know about. I talk about it on a fairly regular basis. I live in Charlottetown now in Prince Edward Island, which is, a nice, peaceful rural area. But 2 2 summers ago, we got hit by a very significant hurricane. It was significant for our region. I know for my friends in Florida and Louisiana, it wasn't big enough that they put storm shutters up, but for our area, it was. And we were completely unprepared. It took an island with a population of 160,000 people, and it wiped out the power for all but 3,000 in this one corner of the island that wasn't affected by the hurricane and the hurricane winds. All the infrastructure pulled down lines, chopped them up. They had to replace poles. And now they're discussing how do they storm-proof that infrastructure. And I look at it and I go, okay, if that's the case, and then we start this conversation, is it, if we are wanting to watch one commodity over any of the others that's going to be key in this kind of area, I have my opinion on what it is. I think it's going to be copper, but what's your thought on it?
Yeah, I think copper straddles both camps. It's an infrastructure component and a decarb component, if you like. It's impossible to overstate the importance of securing more copper for the planet, actually. And I've been looking at it in quite some detail, so people will be familiar with some of the predictions of shortfall in copper supply, even by 2030. We consume around 26 million tonnes of copper now, and 10 or 15% of that's recycled. So we're mining 23, 24 million tonnes per annum, something like that. But there are some forecasts that have copper demand or a shortfall in copper supply reaching 5 to 7 million tonnes by 2030, 32, 33, just depends what forecast you look at. But the interesting thing about copper is, and it's very consistent, it has our use of copper has grown with a compound annual growth rate of around 3 and a bit percent since 1900. And very consistently since 1900, that growth rate equates to a doubling of the use of copper every 25 years. And that goes way back. We can go way back with that, and we've consistently doubled. So even if you use that metric, then 2050, we're tracking towards 50 or 60 million tonnes of copper. I can tell you as a geologist, there's no effing way if we keep going on with what we're doing that we'll be supplying that much copper. And so it's quite possibly an unbelievable rate limiting step on almost everything, as certainly attempts to decarbonize. And you got to remember that doubling of use of copper every 25 years, that's just absolutely normal industrial uses. We are not talking about EVs, wind farms, net zero, anything like that. We've just used that as just copper wiring in houses and things like that. That's our use. All of those other demands which are going to come on the copper are all accretive on top of that. Now, how are we going to do that is problematic. But the other thing, if you look at the price of copper in constant dollar terms, even where it is today, and actually had to update the graph I'm going to use later on today because the price keeps going up in the last couple of days, up to what is it, $11,000 a ton now. But even at $11,000 a ton, it's cheaper now than it was in 1966, right? Which is, and if you look at the band that in constant dollar terms that copper has traded in from about 1966 to the present day, we are still within that band, even though the price has gone up to $11,000 a ton. So it does, in a way, when I look at that, it really explains to me that although we're running into a copper crisis, the price is not reflecting it. And the companies are caught between a rock and a hard place because the price does not yet justify building out additional capacity to supply capital investment. Now, the capital intensity of bringing copper production to market has also increased, just with inflation, with everything else. And it's now a median range of something like $20,000 US per ton of production per annum just to build something. And if you look at that and you look at a price of $8,000 or $9,000 a ton, the return is you barely make a return on it. So that's why there hasn't been investment. And I remember Duncan Walbold, before the current shenanigans going on at BHP, it was the middle of last year, but he made a statement that, the current price would need to be around consistently $15,000 US a ton or above and stay there for the companies to loosen their purse strings and actually invest in new copper supply, just capital spending around their existing mining operations to expand them. And interesting, if you take that current day of $15,000 and you project it back to $2012, that $15,000 is just outside. It's only just above the long-term, in constant currency terms, trading range of copper. So only just getting it going, really, with this. I think if anything, it underpins the copper fundamentals and the copper price. I've actually bought some copper ETFs myself a couple of months ago, because just reading the writing on the wall, believing my own bullshit, I suppose, is another way of putting it.
Well, as you said, every once in a while, you have to drink your own Kool-Aid.
Yeah, drink your own Kool-Aid. Well, there's lots of analogies to use, won't go there. But yeah, so I think the copper conundrum, right? And even people talk about, well, BHP wants to buy Anglo's copper assets, and I think it'd be an unbelievable fit in a BHP. My Anglo mates, if they're listening, will kill me, but it's not doing anything about supply. It's just moving what I call the copper deck chairs around on the Titanic. It's not adding to anything. It's just helping BHP corner more of the supply market.
Yeah. No, and like if I go back to my analogy of what happened in my home province, one of the things that governments have been talking about with critical metals, we must electrify, we must electrify, we must electrify. Well, they're going to have to protect that electric grid, and I see so many things that I understand, on the surface, that they think that's a good idea, but when we're heading into a situation where there may not be, in fact, enough copper, we need to start to rethink some of the things we do. Like, for example, we have offshore wind farms on the northern tip of my island, and they're coming up to the end of life. A lot of the wind turbines don't work any longer, and they're looking at, okay, do we replace these? And I'm looking at it going, okay, it's way out in the middle of the ocean. You have to bring all that power from out there onto land and hook it up to the power grid. And in order to do that, you're having to bring in miles and miles of copper wire just to do that, when we could actually generate power very near without having to use that excess copper. Are you going to start to see, as they start to plan out some of these infrastructure programs, such as offshore wind farms and that, where they're going to go, you know what, we can't afford the copper to do that, so we need to rethink this?
Well, if the price goes up, people have to rethink all of those inputs, of course. That's a hard one to answer. Offshore wind is more, from an engineering point of view, if you've got a nameplate capacity of what an offshore wind can generate, what solar can generate. Offshore wind's always better than solar, just because of the hours of sun in the day. Solar can only ever achieve a 30% efficiency. Offshore wind can get up to 40, 50%. So it's more efficient from that point of view. But where things are relative to the existing grid are important. And we have offshore wind farms aren't that big in Australia, but in an analogous situation, we're looking at building giant solar farms, as you might think, in Australia, but they're in places where the grid can't get to. And it's like they've actually, we Australians, we've actually built quite a few of these things and gone, whoops, we need to build a giant interconnector to take the power into the grid network. A bit of an oversight, and that takes time as well. It really does. But I think with some of these resources, then there'll become contentions around what will we use it for? What's the most efficient deployment of it to solve some of these problems? I see that becoming a harder and harder discussion than 5 to 10 years out from now. I really do.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's a ponderance. You take a look and kind of go, okay, if we're going to run out of copper as the models are projecting, without finding considerably new sources of it, and what do I know? Someone is kicking sand out in the middle of nowhere in South America. They could be finding the next big copper deposit that dwarfs all those copper deposits, for all we know. But that's a wish and a prayer, and we can't operate on wishes and prayers. So your solar farm is like, I guess, the Australian equivalent to offshore. that's where I start to wonder about that. But at the same time, as we talk about all this, we also talk about hardening of infrastructure. And if we are going to have more electrification, we're going to have a more bulletproof electric infrastructure that, a tornado or a hurricane or other natural disasters, or in the case of Texas, snowfall,
Yes.
happen, and it's not going to take down the power grid. And so that people can still charge their electric vehicles, charge their electric homes, and all that such. So, and I know in the utility space, they have a term that it hasn't really found its way too far into the mainstream. It's called undergrounding. That's where they take all those really high power, high tension power lines and they bury them.
Yeah, so there are really interesting technologies in that field now. So high voltage DC and underground, for example, just to transmit power. There's another thing which is available now, not used very much in this part of the world, at least yet, called reconductoring, where just the high tension power lines, this aluminium wrapped in steel, haven't really changed much since we first built them, which was a long time ago, right, over a century ago. But people are now working on new materials, new aluminium composite materials, where you can leave, if you want to not underground it, but you can use the existing poles that are there. They're the most expensive part of an electricity grid, are the poles, not the wires. So you can reuse the existing poles and send 2 to 4 times the amount of energy down those same poles using just the new conductors. So there are technologies around which can help, because if we're going to electrify everything, we need to be able to move, volumes of electricity and energy around the grid like we've not done in the past, and expand the capacity of it to do that extremely rapidly. So there are things that we can be doing right now to help on that front. Interestingly, I was talking about things being, uses of materials, but also power being accretive to what we're already doing. And that's people talking about the data centers a lot lately, and how, Amazon and Microsoft and Google and et cetera spent something like $40 billion in the first quarter of this calendar year building new data center infrastructure to run the AI on. So now people are, especially in parts of the US, are wondering if the local grid can actually carry the power to power the data centers. And they're predicting, normal old boring utility world power consumption might go up 1.5–2% a year. And that's what they've been used to coping with all of these, the reindustrialization of the US plus these data centers have got increases in 14 and 15% being imposed on grids. Now, that's really difficult to deal with, and it's worrying the big technology companies. But now what they're saying is that the use of AI could more efficiently use and deploy power around the existing grid and save 15% of power that would otherwise use just by using the AI that's being built. That sort of almost turns into a zero-sum game. But there are, technology will help us with various elements of what we're trying to do. But I think the requirements to get a lot done are going to start piling up faster and faster. I think it's the, gentle change everyone can cope with, but if you've got an increasing rate of change, which is what I fear that we're entering into now, with climate especially, it's just going to be almost getting impossible to catch your tail in that sort of an environment.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. Like, as I say, like when we hear the discussions coming from the different levels of government at these conferences, and in the last probably about the last 18 to 24 months, their appearance at these conferences has been increasing exponentially, and to the point we have here in New York, I think we have representatives from 5 different levels of federal bureaucracy in attendance at this conference. But it's always about getting the minerals, processing the minerals, and all the demand is just strictly on the electrification. And as we have been discussing here, I think they're missing an even bigger picture of the demand on these metals and materials in the rest of the infrastructure as we we do cope with the changing environment. We do cope with increased demand and capacity on our electricity grids. And I don't think they have a plan for it.
No, I don't either. And are they part of the solution or the problem? There's another question I would have. You keep, as you say, these conferences the last couple of years talk more and more about this, but no one has put their hand up and said we're going to shorten the development approval process from 15 years to 5 or to 3, or in fact, let's make it 2 years because we really need to get going. That is genuine change that the governments can bring about, but they are not doing that. In fact, they're making things even worse. I thought the graphic that was shown this morning of the way the federal government works here in the US and makes all the different agencies to support the critical minerals initiative was gobsmackingly complex. It made a circuit diagram for a computer look simple.
Quite frankly, I kind of thought it was like one of those, psychedelic posters from the 1960s. There was so much color and aura around everything.
Yeah, but it was, I mean, it was the feds putting it up themselves, but to make a point that they sort of get it, they understand it's really difficult. But even then, they were saying that for them to make a change, it takes, by the time it gets back through the President's Department into Congress and back again, is at least 18 months.
Yeah.
To make any sort of a change to that spaghetti map, whatever they call it.
Well, and, as my friends in Louisiana say, if you have to rely on the government, you're in trouble because they move too slow.
And the best thing governments can do is both assist and get out of the way at the same time. And it's not their expertise. It's just, yes, look after the big picture. Take away the red tape, green tape, rationally, just make it a rational process. Give people who are trying to develop projects a single point in contact to get things done. Just little things like that would be tremendously helpful. Not just picking on the USA here, we have the same issues in Australia as well.
We have the same issues in Canada.
Yeah. So it's when I talk later on today, I'm going to be talking about the Schrodinger's world of the resources world. And the fact that not everything can happen at the same time or be right at the same time. And we're not, as a society and government and even our own industry, has not really got a grip on that at the moment. Everyone thinks it will be fine if we do this, but that's just absolutely impossible to get it all done at the same time with what we're certainly going about it the way we are now. And even this morning or today, there's a story in there because we're actually talking about nuclear power in Australia, which no one had even spoken about. You'd be shot on sight. But now it's being openly discussed. But the CSIRO came and said, if we were to build a large-scale nuclear reactor, it would cost $17 billion and would be completed about 2040, which I think are absolutely pretty. Those numbers sound about right to me to get something of that scale and magnitude done. But that's 2040. I mean, we're talking about the horse bolting. We're going to have to do a whole lot of hardening before we get to any of those sorts of solutions.
Yeah, and you're going to need more electricity, so there's going to be more copper, and on and on and on it goes. If people want to hear more of your musings and discussions of these critical topics as we move over through the electrification and hardening of the world, how would they follow you, Dave?
Well, I can listen to your podcast, of course, or the other easy way to find me is just on LinkedIn, actually. My surname is weird and silly enough that I'm pretty easy to track down on the internet. So I'd recommend those as the best ways to get hold of me.
Yes, that is Dr. Dave Lawie at Lawie. And thank you very much for joining me. And I'm sure our paths are going to cross again before this year is over.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It was great.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.